Good morning, guys. Does anybody remember where we were when we left off? Let's see. George Washington was going to be part of a party, but it wasn't a singing and dancing party. It was a party as in a group of people. Remember, he was going to be part of a group of people that went to the Shenandoah Valley to do surveying, because that family had a lot of acreage. Let me have a sip of my tea and we will get started on chapter 3. Chapter 3, An Adventurous Career. George was happier than ever that he had chosen land surveying as his profession. Surveyors were very important people in colonial Virginia. They played a major role in opening up the vast new lands that lay to the west of the original 13 American colonies. "Get ready for the greatest adventure of your life," George William Fairfax said. "Life in the wilderness is nothing like life at Ferry Farm and Mount Vernon. Back home, the slaves do everything. Now you'll be lucky even to have shelter at night. Most likely you'll have to sleep in the woods. And remember, there are bears and rattlesnakes there." "I've had plenty of soft living. Now I want to be tough and learn how to take care of myself," George replied. George survived the hard trip extremely well. During 33 days in the wilds of the Shenandoah Valley, he never complained. He slept outdoors on the bare ground and cooked his own meals over a campfire. One night, a farmer invited the group of surveyors to spend the night in his house, but they had to sleep on the straw mats full of bed bugs and fleas. Ew. And when he served them breakfast, there was no silverware. Surveying the land was very difficult. The forests were so thick that it was impossible to make exact measurements. And the paths were so rocky that the horses often stumbled and nearly threw their riders. Wonder what this is going to be talking about, guys. That illustration is entitled "Strange People Out There." To make matters worse, it rained almost every day. The surveyors had to work in wet clothes and muddy boots. But George enjoyed the work, and he earned a good amount of money for that time. "It was certainly different," George told Lawrence when he returned to Belvoir. "There were some strange people out there, pioneers with thick beards and shirts made from deerskin. They tell time by the sun. There were settlers from Germany who couldn't speak a word of English, trappers who caught animals in order to sell their fur, and Indians in war paint and feathers. And some of them even had human hair strung around their waists." "That must have frightened you," Lawrence laughed. "Luckily, the Indians turned out to be friendlier than they looked," George replied. "In fact, they showed us their war dances, and we smoked peace pipes together." "It's a good thing you learned something about the tribes," Lawrence said. "But most important, I hear you did a very good job surveying the Shenandoah land." Indeed, the head of the survey team had high praise for George. "You performed your duties extremely well on your first trip to the wilderness, George," he said. "I believe you're ready to earn a living as a land surveyor, and it is a very honorable profession, if I do say so myself." George took a short course at William and Mary College in Williamsburg, Virginia. He passed the test and got an official surveyor's license. But in addition to surveying land, he wished to purchase some land for himself. He could see that in 5 or 10 years, the Shenandoah Valley would change from wilderness to settled area, with farmhouses instead of log cabins, roads instead of trails, and plowed fields instead of meadows and forest. This illustration shows him talking with the head of the surveying team. changes had already occurred in the area where George grew up. When his parents had moved to Ferry Farm on the upper river, the area was still mostly unsettled. By 1744, it had so many people it had become a county named Fairfax. George was hired by the Fairfax County surveyor to help lay out the streets and measure the lots for the houses and the other buildings in the county's first town, which came to be called Alexandria. His survey maps of Alexandria were so good that he became the chief surveyor of Culpeper County. It was about 30 miles from Fredericksburg, where he had gone by ferry as a child. In addition to this job, George was hired by Lord Fairfax to survey more land in the Shenandoah Valley. At the age of 18, George already had a successful career. George's second trip to the wilderness was not nearly so enjoyable as his first. For one thing, he had to go alone. For another, he made the journey in the winter. The weather was so cold and damp that no matter how close to the fire he slept in his bearskin blanket, he couldn't get warm. The only thing that made the trip worthwhile was the large sum of money he made. George William Fairfax greeted George on his return and introduced him to his new bride, Sally. George was shy with women, but Sally was so friendly that he felt at ease right away. He hoped that someday he might find a wife as pretty and charming as Sally. Both George William and Lawrence were members of the House of Burgesses, the body of elected delegates that made Virginia's laws. Lawrence missed many of the sessions that winter because of an illness that wouldn't go away. He often felt too weak to leave Mount Vernon. Finally, when summer came, he was well enough to travel to London on business. Even the doctors there could not figure out what was wrong with him or how to cure him. In fact, Lawrence had tuberculosis, a very serious disease. Here's an illustration of George working as a surveyor. Lawrence had better luck with his business deal. The King of England granted him 200,000 acres of land in Ohio to develop and sell. The king wanted settlements and forts there so that the French would not be able to seize the Ohio region. The British and French were rivals in a struggle to claim lands in North America. George Washington earned a good deal of money in his job as surveyor of Culpeper County. He saved enough to buy 3 large tracts of land in the Shenandoah Valley. He also looked forward to surveying the land in Ohio that now belonged to Lawrence. George not only worked hard, but he also played hard. He attended parties, picnics, barbecues, and dances. He and Lawrence went fox hunting with the Fairfaxes or dunk hunting in the marshes. George also spent time with his younger brothers. They liked to go George also spent time with his younger brothers. They liked to go to horse races or play cards and billiards in the taverns of Fredericksburg. Spending time with the Fairfax family gave George an education that he could never have got at school. The Fairfaxes had a long tradition of defending individual liberty and freedom and rebelling against the English kings who exercised absolute power. The Fairfaxes and other members of the English land-owning class found their inspiration in the famous men of the ancient Republic of Rome. These men were well known for their morals and courage. They also had a strong sense of duty, honor, and service to their country. The Fairfaxes put on amateur performances of plays from the Roman period that reflected these ideas. George participated actively in these home theatricals. His favorite drama was Cato, the story of a man who sacrificed many of life's comforts to seek personal perfection. Such ideas had a powerful influence on George Washington, who was guided by them in his daily life. During his late teenage years, George was very worried about Lawrence's health. His big brother felt fine during the summer, but during cold weather his illness returned. His doctor told him to spend the next winter in a warmer climate. Lawrence decided to sail to the island of Barbados. Since he was too weak to travel alone, and Nancy didn't want to take their new baby to a strange place, George went with him. The time away from his job as a surveyor meant a loss of money, but Lawrence's health was more important to him than anything else. The voyage to Barbados took more than a month. George was bored with the lack of activity on the ship. When they finally arrived, he lost no time exploring the island. There were lovely white houses, fields of pineapple and sugarcane, and gardens full of tropical flowers. But most of all, George enjoyed seeing the fort that the British had built to defend Barbados from enemy attack. Lawrence's health began to improve, but then George caught a dreadful disease called smallpox and nearly died. Today there are vaccinations to protect people from smallpox, but during George Washington's lifetime, many people got the disease and many died. The high fever, terrible headaches, and blisters all over his body made George miserable. After George recovered, Lawrence told him to return to Virginia. George didn't want to leave his brother, but Lawrence seemed to be able to manage alone. When George landed in America, he delivered some letters from people in Barbados to Virginia's new royal governor, Robert Dinwiddie. He and the governor discovered many common interests, especially since Mr. Dinwiddie was also a land surveyor. George was honored to be invited to dine at the governor's mansion. See that? Let me have a sip of my tea, guys. George began to worry about Lawrence. A doctor had finally diagnosed his illness, but there was no cure. Lawrence's letters sounded more and more discouraging. Then one day in June, a ship docked in the Potomac off Mount Vernon, and Lawrence staggered weakly to shore. His body was wasted, and his voice was barely above a whisper. George knew that his brother had come home to die. George was 20 when Lawrence passed away. Since the death of Augustine Washington, George had become more attached to Lawrence, who was like a father to him. His brother's death was a great loss, not only to his family, but to the colony of Virginia, where he had played a leading role. Lawrence left Mount Vernon to his wife, but George was named as executor of the will, and a position that put him in charge of Lawrence's business and financial affairs. George missed him terribly. He wanted to carry out his duties in a way that would have made Lawrence proud. George unquestioningly assumed Lawrence's role as head of the Washington family. Although he was barely out of his teens, George was extraordinarily mature. At 6 feet 2 inches tall and broad-shouldered, a giant compared to most men of his time, he was both sensible and ambitious. Carrying out Lawrence's responsibilities at Mount Vernon, George took over the management of the plantation. George also wanted to follow in Lawrence's footsteps in public life. His chief goal was to fill his brother's position as Adjutant General of Virginia. Although only 21 years old and with no military experience, George wrote to Governor Dinwiddie to propose himself as Lawrence's replacement. Instead of appointing a single individual to replace Lawrence, the governor planned to divide the colony of Virginia into 3 militia districts and select an adjutant for each. All three men he intended to choose were much older than George and had lots of experience. George, however, was determined to play a leading role in colonial affairs. Therefore, when the governor didn't reply to George's letter, he wrote a second time. His persistence brought success. In addition to appointing the three adjutants that he had in mind, Governor Dinwiddie created a fourth militia district, which covered the counties in southern Virginia, and he named George Washington as the adjutant for this district. "Why not give a boy a chance?" said the governor to his aides, who expressed great surprise at his choice. "He is certainly persistent, and he wants so badly to be like his brother. I spent an evening with George, and he seems to be a fine young man." On February 1st, 1753, only a few weeks before his 21st birthday, George Washington took his oath of office. He wore a new uniform of red breeches and dark blue coat with brass buttons. A sword with a silver handle was strapped to his waist. George's new title was Major Washington. As adjutant, George stood ready to train the militia from southern Virginia. Perhaps one day he would have to lead the militiamen into combat against an invasion across the frontier, or as part of the British-French struggle for control of North America. Whatever the future might hold, young Major Washington was ready to do his duty. One day, Governor Dinwiddie summoned George to his office. "There is trouble in the Ohio Valley," the governor said. "French soldiers have been coming down the Ohio River from Canada. They have built a fort in English territory south of Lake Erie. They have made alliances with several Indian tribes and are attacking English settlers. We must make sure that the Ohio Territory remains in British hands and that our people there can live in peace. I shall take a message to the French ordering them to abandon their fort and warning them to stay off English land," George offered. "This will be a dangerous mission," the governor warned. "The Ohio Valley is 1,000 miles away. The journey will be full of hazards, but you have a well-earned reputation for courage and skill. If anyone can carry out this task, it is you, George." "I shall be honored to serve you," Washington replied. "I'll find guides and interpreters and leave for Ohio at once." Here he is talking to the governor, and he says, "This will be a dangerous mission." And that, my friends, is the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 is called A Wilderness Journey, and we will listen to that one tomorrow.